On May 21, 1990, around 2 a.m., police got a call about multiple murders at a house on the corner of Mason and Elm Street in Salida, California. When they arrived, they found 4 victims: 35-year-old Dennis Colwell, 25-year-old Richard Ritchie, 51-year-old Franklin Raper, and 23-year-old Darlene Paris. There was one survivor, Donna Alvarez. When the attack began, Donna managed to escape. She hid in the garage under a pile of clothes and stayed there, trembling, until everything went quiet. Once she felt it was safe, she slipped out and ran to a neighbor's house. The neighbor let her in, and Donna, still shaken and in shock, told them what had happened. They immediately called the police. When officers arrived, she told them everything she could remember. Donna said she'd been staying at Franklin Raper's house because she had nowhere else to go. Franklin was known for helping people in need. That night, a group of people wearing camouflage broke into the house through the doors and windows, attacking everyone inside. Donna recalled one of the attackers clearly: a white man, about 6 feet tall, with afro-like hair, holding a silver gun. Unlike the others, he wasn't wearing a mask. That description stood out to the police. While they were still at the scene, an officer spotted a man lingering nearby. When the officers asked if he knew anyone who fit the description, the man mentioned a person named Jason who lived at the camp. The camp turned out to be an old labor site where people lived in campers and trailers. Neighbors told the police the group there behaved like a strange military-style gang and frequently intimidated the locals. They also shared the names of 4 men living at the camp: Gerald Cruz, David Beck, Ricky Vieira, and Jason LaMarche. Police learned that Franklin Raper, one of the victims, had once lived at the camp but moved out after a dispute with the group. This link made the camp their next focus. Before heading to the camp, police ran Jason LaMarche's name through their system. He had a criminal record, and they were able to pull up a photo. When they showed Donna a lineup, she immediately identified Jason as the man she had seen during the attack. With Jason now their prime suspect, the police went to the camp to investigate. However, when they arrived, the place was strangely quiet. No one was there. As they searched the area, they began to notice details that deepened the mystery. The first thing they noticed was a small studio house tucked away toward the back. Outside, the officers noticed camouflage clothing hanging on a clothesline, like it had just been washed. This caught their attention because it matched the description Donna had given them. They soon learned the house belonged to Gerald Cruz and his wife, Jennifer. The police thought about leaving and coming back later since no one seemed to be home. However, just as they were about to go, Gerald Cruz pulled up in his car. He stepped out, and the officers casually began asking him questions to see how he'd respond. Gerald remained calm and claimed he knew nothing about the murders they were investigating, denying any involvement. Before leaving, the detectives asked him who else lived at the camp. Gerald mentioned 3 other people: David Beck, Jason LaMarche, and Ricky Vieira. Afterward, the police left and immediately worked on getting a search warrant. With the positive ID of Jason LaMarche and the camouflage clothing as evidence, they had enough to secure it. When they returned to search, they uncovered unsettling things inside Gerald and Jennifer's house. They found bomb-making materials, military manuals, and a book titled The Big Book of Secret Hiding Places, which gave tips on hiding contraband. There were also satanic books, including the Satanic Bible, and something even stranger, a wooden wheel with different punishments written on it. But that wasn't all. As they dug deeper, they found journals that painted a much darker picture. The journals revealed that the group living there appeared to be part of a cult, led by none other than Gerald Cruz. To understand how it all came to this, it's important to look at Gerald's past, which was just as complicated. Gerald Dean Cox was born on March 1, 1962, in Modesto, California. Right from the start, his family life was complicated. His father, Asensio Cruz, had moved to Mexico before Gerald was born, so his mother, Hortensia Cruz, raised him on her own. However, Hortensia listed another man, Lawrence Cox, on Gerald's birth certificate. This confusion about his parentage followed Gerald throughout his life. Adding to the struggles, Gerald suffered 2 serious head injuries as a child, which only made things more difficult. When Gerald was an infant, his stepsister Hope accidentally dropped him on concrete, injuring his head. Despite the injury, the family didn't take him to the hospital, thinking he would be fine. Then, when he was 4 years old, Gerald went through a car windshield in an accident, but once again, no medical help was sought. Over the years, Gerald heard different stories about his parents. One of his mother's ex-husbands told him that Asensio wasn't his real father. Later, his half-sister Marlene claimed that Hope was his biological mother, and that Lawrence Cox was his real father. However, it's still unclear whether Hope was truly his sister or his mother. This mystery surrounding his family only added to the confusion in Gerald's life. Experts later said that Gerald's confusion about his identity affected him. Not knowing who his parents were left him searching for a sense of self. Since he couldn't find it, he created one for himself. He convinced himself he was special, that he had unique powers or abilities, and over time he started to believe in these delusions. Combined with his traumatic childhood, these beliefs shaped him into the person he became as an adult. As Gerald got older, things took an even darker turn. His beliefs became harder to pin down, but one thing was clear. He had an obsession with white supremacy and often talked about a master race. The cult he later created revolved entirely around him. It wasn't built on any clear or consistent ideology. It was all about Gerald. This type of group is often called a cult of personality, where the leader is the central figure and the beliefs are secondary. Gerald began targeting vulnerable people, those who were homeless, estranged from their families or had nowhere else to go. He'd lure them in by offering a safe place to stay and promising they'd be part of a family. At first, things seemed fine, even good. But once Gerald had people depending on him, everything changed. That's when his darker, more controlling side would take over. A psychologist who studied his case described Gerald as someone who had withdrawn from society and created what they called a Neanderthal clan, a group of people who relied on him. This description fit perfectly. Over time, Gerald also developed a strong interest in black magic, witchcraft, and Satanism. While these beliefs alone don't necessarily lead to violence or cult behavior, in Gerald's case they became part of the disturbing persona he created for himself. By his early 20s, Gerald was living in a house in Modesto. That's where he met Ricky Vieira. Ricky was around 15 or 16 at the time and came from a horrible home life. His father abused him, and his mother neglected him. Desperate for a way out, Ricky was drawn to Gerald, who promised to take care of him and give him a fresh start. Gerald offered him a place to stay and made him feel like part of a family. At first, Ricky felt like he finally belonged somewhere, but that feeling didn't last long. Around the same time, two of Gerald's childhood friends, David Beck and Stephen Perkins, also joined the group. Gerald had known David since they were kids, but they had lost touch over the years. David had once been successful. He was married, had a good career, and was deeply religious. However, after his divorce, his life started to fall apart. When he reconnected with Gerald, he seemed lost, and Gerald took advantage of that. David eventually became Gerald's second in command. David's family later said he changed completely after getting involved with Gerald. He had once been a happy, devoted father and a regular churchgoer, but Gerald's influence turned him into someone they barely recognized. Around this time, Gerald began building the foundation of his cult. He gave all the men journals, the same ones the police later found during their search. Gerald told the men to write in them constantly, about their fears, insecurities, and thoughts, almost like therapy. But instead of helping, he used what they wrote against them. He read through their words, using their vulnerabilities to manipulate them. Gerald kept a journal for himself too. In a disturbing act of control, he made the men cut their hands and leave bloody fingerprints inside his journal like they were signing a loyalty contract. On top of this, Gerald began holding weekly ceremonies. The men wore white robes that resembled Ku Klux Klan robes, lit candles, and chanted meaningless words. An expert later described the cult as being all over the place. One moment they talked about God, then military stuff, then black magic. It was clear Gerald didn't know what he was doing. As time passed, the abuse escalated. Gerald took pleasure in tormenting the men. One of his favorite ways to hurt them was by making them stand completely still in the middle of a room, only to punch them hard in the stomach. One time, he punched Stephen Perkins so hard that Stephen ended up in the hospital. Gerald also used a scorpion stun gun on the men, just for his amusement. David, who had become Gerald's right-hand man, was never abused. Instead, he joined Gerald in hurting the others. Together, they created something called the Orange Line treatment. Gerald would cut an orange extension cord, tape the exposed wires to one of the men's feet, and plug it into an outlet controlled by a light switch. When Gerald flipped the switch, the men would be electrocuted, while he and David laughed. After one such incident, Stephen's foot turned black and became severely infected. By 1987, Gerald began dating a 16-year-old girl named Jennifer Starn. Even though he was 25, Jennifer moved in with Gerald, along with Vera and Perkins. By this time, Gerald had complete control over Vera and Perkins, both mentally and physically, and he would openly mistreat them in front of Jennifer. Soon after, he started mistreating Jennifer as well. When Jennifer became pregnant, the mistreatment didn't stop. On one occasion, when she was 2 months pregnant, Gerald kicked her in the stomach and between her legs, causing her to bleed. In fear, she ran barefoot to a women's shelter and stayed there for 4 days. However, Gerald found out where she was and convinced her to return. Eventually, Jennifer had 3 children with Gerald. However, the mistreatment only worsened, and Gerald didn't spare their infant children either. According to court documents, one child, referred to as Baby A to protect her identity, was subjected to cruel treatment by Gerald starting at just 6 months old. Gerald locked her in a dark room for hours, only allowing Jennifer to check on her every 6 hours. But she wasn't allowed to comfort or hold her. It was as if Baby A was in solitary confinement. In late 1989, Gerald, Jennifer, and their 2 children moved to a camp. Ricky moved with them and stayed in a trailer nearby, while Stephen returned to his parents' home. Although Stephen wasn't living with Gerald anymore, the trauma from his time in that house was clear. Stephen's father shared that during the 17 months his son lived with Gerald, he lost 125 pounds and completely changed. Stephen became withdrawn, stopped speaking to people, and refused to leave the house. He even claimed his injuries were from a motorcycle accident, as Gerald had instructed him. Stephen had broken bones from the beatings and an infected foot from the orange line treatment. His mental state deteriorated so much that he eventually had to admit himself to a psychiatric hospital. At the camp, David and Ricky stayed close to Gerald, and the abuse worsened. Gerald introduced the Wheel of Punishment, a wooden wheel with sections for different punishments, like eating off the floor, solitary confinement, severe beatings, and more. Gerald made the men spin the wheel to determine their punishment. One of the worst punishments involved forcing the men to do things they didn't want to, while the group watched. Ricky was often the target of this abuse. In early 1990, 2 new members, Jason LaMarche and Franklin Raper, joined the group. Jason only knew Gerald and the others for a short time before the murders took place. Jason quickly fit in with Gerald and his group at the camp, but Franklin wasn't as well received. He didn't get along with anyone, and things worsened after Jason discovered his gun had gone missing from his pocket while he was sleeping. He suspected Franklin had stolen it, even though he couldn't prove it. Jason's dislike for Franklin grew stronger, and he frequently complained about him to Gerald. Gerald also claimed he didn't like Franklin, saying it was because Franklin used harmful substances and left dangerous items around, which he said put the kids at risk. However, considering Gerald's own behavior, it's hard to believe that was the real reason. Franklin eventually moved to a house on Elm Street, which was connected to the group because Jason's girlfriend, Michelle Evans, had ties to that house. But Gerald wasn't happy with just making Franklin leave. He wanted to get rid of him completely. The morning before the murders, Michelle went to the Elm Street house to pick up some furniture. She asked Gerald, Jason, and a few others to help her. They were aware that Franklin would be there, and when Jason and Franklin ended up in an argument, it seemed to push Gerald over the edge. Later that day, Gerald called the group, Michelle, Jason, Ricky, David, and Ron, together in Jason's trailer and revealed his plan. He decided Franklin had to be killed, along with anyone else in the house. Gerald gave everyone specific roles. Michelle was tasked with drawing a map of the house, marking the doors and windows, and making sure everyone was gathered in the living room to make the attack easier. Just after midnight on May 21st, Gerald, Jason, Michelle, Ricky, David, and Ron got into a car and headed to Franklin's house. They were armed with knives, bats, and batons, ready to carry out their violent plan. Everyone, except Michelle and Jason, dressed in camouflage and masks to stay unnoticed. Jason carried a gun, but it seemed like it was meant to scare more than anything else. The group parked a little down the street, knowing Franklin wasn't alone in the house. 4 other people were there: Dennis Colwell, Richard Ritchie, Darlene Paris, and Donna Alvarez. This wasn't unusual since Franklin often let others stay with him. With everything planned, Michelle and Jason stepped out of the car and made their way toward the house, ready to put the plan in motion. Michelle entered the house first to ensure the doors and windows were unlocked. Her presence didn't seem odd. It was her sister Tanya's house after all. Earlier, under Gerald's orders, Michelle had called Tanya and told her not to come home that night, so Tanya wasn't there. Donna Alvarez, the only person to survive the events, was asleep in a bedroom when Michelle woke her up. She lightly tapped her shoulder and told her she needed to leave because Tanya needed the room. Without suspecting anything, Donna grabbed her belongings and left the room. Before leaving, Michelle unlocked a window to allow the men to enter. Donna then went to the living room where Franklin sat in a chair. She asked him where she could sleep, and he casually replied, "Anywhere." Donna and Richard Ritchie headed toward another bedroom to rest, but things quickly took a dark turn. David and Ricky climbed in through the unlocked window, storming into the living room, followed by the rest of the group. Chaos erupted as people screamed and panicked, unsure of what was happening. Realizing how far things had gone, Michelle decided to leave. She walked out of the house, heading back to the car. As she left, she heard a woman's screams and desperate pleas. That woman was Darlene Paris. Meanwhile, Donna managed to escape the chaos by sneaking into the garage. She hid under a pile of dirty clothes and stayed there until everything ended. Inside, Jason targeted Franklin, who was still sitting in the chair. Jason attacked him with a bat, striking him so hard that it broke Franklin's arm as he tried to shield himself. Jason didn't stop until Franklin was barely recognizable, then ended his life. Gerald and the others turned their attention to Dennis Colwell and Richard Ritchie. Darlene Paris, overwhelmed with fear, begged for mercy, but Gerald coldly instructed Ricky to silence her. He pulled Darlene back by her hair and ended her life in a brutal and shocking way. One of the victims tried to flee, making it to the front lawn, but Gerald and Ron caught up to him. They attacked him viciously and left him lifeless on the lawn. Neighbors, witnessing the horrifying scene, saw Gerald's actions but, out of shock and fear, chose to retreat indoors without intervening. By the end, all 4 victims had been brutally attacked with bats or batons before their lives were tragically taken. Now let's return to Gerald's house, where the police were actively investigating the scene. They found unsettling items, including materials for making bombs, a will of punishment, military gear, a Satanic Bible, and several journals. These findings were enough to arrest both Gerald and his wife. Gerald denied everything, claiming he had been at a motel in Oakdale with Ricky and David on the night of the murders. The police quickly issued an alert to find Ricky Vieira, David Beck, and Jason LaMarche. They eventually tracked down Ricky and David and took them into custody, but Jason was still missing. The police saw Ricky as the most likely to break under pressure. They were right. Ricky, nervous and scared, started talking. He revealed disturbing details about the abuse and the cult. Ricky started confessing to everything: the beatings, the abuse, the will of punishment, and the journals. He wasn't admitting to the murder at first, but that changed when the police convinced him to take a polygraph test. As the technician began setting up the polygraph, Ricky unexpectedly admitted that he had killed Darlene Paris, revealing the truth to the authorities. At the same time, Jason was still on the run. While Ron Willie had already been captured, Jason remained the final person they needed to apprehend. The police tracked down his mother, who told them he was driving a white Hyundai. They found the car at a gas station, but it wasn't Jason driving. It was a friend of his. The friend explained that Jason had borrowed the car days before the murders. The police then focused on a blue Nissan pickup. They found it, but by the time they got there, Jason had already disappeared. Then, about a week later, they got a tip. A woman called and said Jason had asked her for a ride to Oregon. She agreed, not knowing about the murders. On the way, Jason started confessing to everything. She stayed calm, acting like it wasn't a big deal, but when they stopped at a motel for the night, she slipped away to call the police. Officers surrounded the motel, and Jason was finally arrested. All the men were eventually questioned and charged with murder. Gerald, David, and Ricky were convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. They're still on death row. Jason LaMarche received 64 years to life after being convicted of second-degree murder. As for Michelle Evans, she made a plea deal and testified in exchange for a lighter sentence. She only spent 6 months in prison after being found guilty as an accessory. Ricky kept appealing his conviction, claiming Gerald had brainwashed him. He said he was scared for his life and only committed the murders because he feared Gerald. While it's clear Ricky was manipulated, he still played a role in the crime and deserves his sentence. What do you think? Should the cult members have been sentenced to death? And was 6 months enough for Michelle Evans? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this video interesting, please give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe for more true crime stories. Your support helps me grow the channel and bring more compelling cases to light. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.